Well, with U.S. military forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq, as well as bases in Turkey, Iran is literally surrounded now by U.S.
All through Central Asia, too.
And through Central Asia in the north. Might not that objective reality on the ground radicalize forces inside Iran to, develop nuclear weapons if they don't already have them in self-defense?
No, it's very likely. I mean, there's a lot of illusions about this, but the little evidence we have, serious evidence, indicates that the Israeli bombing of the Osirak reactor
in 1981
probably stimulated and may have even initiated the Iraqi nuclear weapons development program.
But they were already engaged in it.
They were engaged in building a nuclear plant, but what it was, nobody knew. It was investigated on the ground after the bombing by a well-known nuclear physicist from Harvard. They published his analysis in the leading scientific journal, Nature. And according to him, it was a power plant. Other Iraqi sources, exiles, have indicated, we can't prove it, that nothing much was going on. It was, they may have been toying with the idea of nuclear weapons, but that the bombing of it did stimulate the nuclear weapons program. You can't prove this, but that's what the evidence looks like.
What does the Iraq war and occupation mean for the Palestinians?
Disaster.
No roadmaps to peace?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to read it. One of the rules of journalism, I don't know exactly how it got established, but it's absolute consistency, is that when you mention George Bush's name in an article, the headline has to speak of his vision, and the article has to talk about his dreams, and that maybe there'll be a photograph of him right next to it peering into the distance. And one of George Bush's dreams and visions is to have a Palestinian state somewhere, sometime, in some unspecified place, maybe in the Saudi desert. And we are supposed to worship and praise that as a magnificent vision. It has become a convention of journalism. The vision and the dream is that maybe the United States will stop undermining totally the long-term efforts of the rest of the world, virtually without exception, to create some kind of a viable political settlement. Up until now, the U.S. has been blocking it for the last 25, 30 years. The Bush administration went even further in blocking it, sometimes in pretty extreme ways, so extreme that they weren't even reported here. So, for example, last December at the UN, for the first time, the Bush administration reversed U.S. policy on Jerusalem. Up until now, the U.S. had, at least in principle, gone along with the 1968 Security Council resolution ordering Israel to revoke its annexation and occupation and settlement policies in East Jerusalem. And for the first time last December, the Bush administration reversed that. That's one of many cases intended to undermine the possibility of any meaningful political settlement. A couple of days ago, weeks ago, I guess, Bush made what was called his first significant pronouncement on Middle East, on the Israel-Arab problem. He gave a speech, headlines, first significant statement in years, and so on. Well, if you read it, it was boilerplate, except for one sentence. That one sentence, if you take a look at it closely, what it said is, as the peace process advances, Israel should terminate new settlement programs. Okay, what does that mean? That means until the peace process reaches a point that Bush endorses, which could be indefinitely far in the future, until then, Israel should continue to build settlements. Okay, that's a change in policy. Up until now, officially at least, the U.S. has been opposed to expansion of the illegal settlement programs that make a political settlement impossible. But now Bush is saying the opposite. He said, go on, settle. Fine, we'll keep paying for it until we decide that somehow the peace process has reached an adequate point. So yes, it was a significant change towards more aggression, undermining of international law, and undermining of the possibilities of peace.
You've described the level of public protest and resistance to the Iraq War as unprecedented. Never before has there been so much opposition before a war began. Where is that resistance going? If you could talk about it inside the United States and then internationally.
I don't know any way to predict human affairs. It'll go the way people decide it'll go. There are many possibilities. It should intensify. I mean, the tasks are now much greater and more serious than they were before. On the other hand, it's harder. It's just psychologically easier to organize to oppose a military attack than it is to oppose a long-standing program of imperial ambition, of which this attack is one phase, and of which others are going to come next. That takes more thought, more dedication, more long-term engagement. It's the difference between being deciding, okay, I'm in this for the long haul, and saying, okay, I'm going out to a demonstration tomorrow, and then back home. Those are choices all the time. Same in the civil rights movement, the women's movement, anything.
Do we need to be concerned about threats to and intimidation of dissidents here inside the United States, and including random roundups of immigrants and green card holders and citizens for that matter?
Well, vulnerable people like immigrants definitely have to be concerned. I mean, the current government has claimed rights which go beyond any precedent. There's some in wartime, but those are pretty ugly ones, like rounding up the Japanese, or, say, Wilson during the First World War, which was pretty awful. But they're now claiming rights that are quite without precedent, including even the right to arrest citizens, hold them in detention without access to family or lawyers, and do so indefinitely without charges. That's unique. And immigrants and other vulnerable people should certainly be cautious. On the other hand, for us, people like us, people with citizens with any privilege, though there are threats, as compared with what people face in most of the world, they're so slight that it's hard to get very upset about them. I mean, I've just been back from Turkey a couple of times and Colombia, and compared with the threats that people face there, we're living in heaven.
With the U.S. economy deteriorating and with layoffs and the prospect of more layoffs and economic downturn on the horizon, how is the Bush administration going to maintain, which is what some people are calling a garrison state here at home and a state of permanent war overseas with occupation of numerous countries? How are they going to pull it off?
They have to pull it off for about another 6 years. By that time, they hope they will have institutionalized highly reactionary programs within the United States. They'll have left the economy in a very serious state, huge deficit and so on. Pretty much the way they did in the 1980s. And then it'll be somebody else's problem to patch it together. Meanwhile, they will have, they hope, undermined social programs, diminish democracy, which of course they hate, by transferring decisions out of the public arena into private hands, and do it in a way that it'll be very hard to disentangle. So they'll have left a legacy internally that will be painful and hard, but only for the majority of the population. I mean, the people they're concerned about are going to be making out like bandits. They're very much like the Reagan years. It's the same people, after all. And internationally, they hope that they will have institutionalized the doctrines of imperial domination through force and preventive war as choice. I mean, the U.S. now in military force, in military spending, probably exceeds the rest of the world combined, and it's much more advanced and moving off into extremely dangerous directions like space. And they assume, I suppose, that no matter what happens to the American economy, that'll give such overwhelming force that people will just have to do what they say.
What do you say to the peace activists in the United States who really labored for long trying to prevent the attack and invasion of Iraq, and who are now feeling a sense of anger that the U.S. has done this, and an enormous amount of sadness?
I think that they should be realistic. Take, say, abolitionism. How long did the struggle go on before they made any progress? I mean, if you give up every time you don't achieve the immediate gain you want, you're just guaranteeing that the worst is going to happen. These are long, hard struggles. And in fact, what happened in the last couple of months should be seen quite positively. I mean, the basis was created for expansion and development of a peace and justice movement that will move on to much harder tasks. And that's the way these things go. You don't win an easy victory and go home.
Boulder, Colorado, April 5th, 2003.
In recent years, the Pentagon and then the media have adopted this term collateral damage to describe the death of civilians. Talk about the role of language in shaping and forming people's understanding of events.
Well, it has nothing much to do with language. I mean, language is the way we interact and communicate. So naturally, the means of communication and the conceptual background that's behind it, which is more important, are used to try to shape attitudes and opinions and induce conformity and subordination. This has been true forever, but it became an organized and very self-conscious industry, really in the last century. And not surprisingly, it was created in the more democratic societies. So the first coordinated propaganda ministry, called Ministry of Information, was in Britain during the First World War. It had the task, as they put it, of controlling the mind of the world. And what they were particularly concerned with was the mind of America, and more specifically, the mind of American intellectuals. They thought if they could convince American intellectuals of the nobility of the British war effort, then American intellectuals could succeed in driving the basically pacifist population of the United States, which didn't want to have anything to do with European wars, rightly, to drive them into a fit of fanaticism and hysteria, which would get them to join the war. And Britain needed U.S. backing. So Britain had its Ministry of Information, aimed primarily at American opinion and opinion leaders, and the U.S., the Wilson administration reacted by setting up the first state propaganda agency here, called the Committee on Public Information. This is already Orwellian, of course. We don't have to even comment on what a Committee on Public Information is, but it succeeded. It succeeded brilliantly, in fact, mainly with liberal American intellectuals, people of the John Dewey circle, who actually took pride in the fact that they were, for the first time in history, according to their picture, a wartime fanaticism was created not by military leaders and population and politicians, but by the more responsible, serious members of the community, namely thoughtful intellectuals. And they did organize a campaign of propaganda which within a few months did succeed in turning a relatively pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics who wanted to destroy everything German. I mean, reached the point where the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Bach. The country was driven into a hysteria. Wilson had won the election on the slogan "Peace without victory," but within a couple of months he turned the country into fanatics who wanted to win victory and destroy everything German and no peace. And that had an impact. The members of the committee of Wilson's propaganda agency included people like Edward Bernays, who became the guru of the public relations industry, and Walter Lippmann, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, the most respected media figure. And they very explicitly drew from that experience. You look at their writings in the 1920s, they said, okay, we've learned from this that you can control the public mind. You can control attitudes and opinions. That's where Lippmann said we can manufacture consent by the means of propaganda. Bernays said the more intelligent members of the community can drive the population into whatever they want by what he called engineering of consent. It's the essence of democracy, he said, both of them held. It also led to the rise of the public relations industry. I mean, it sort of existed before that, but it was very impressed by this achievement. From that comes the enormous public relations industry, which was based on an interesting conception. It's interesting to look at their thinking back in the 20s when it really got started. This was the period of Taylorism in industry, when workers were being trained to become robots. And that was extremely impressive. It created a highly efficient industry with human beings being turned into automata. Bolsheviks were very impressed with it too. They tried to duplicate it. In fact, they tried throughout the world. But the thought control experts realized that you could not only have what was called on-job control, but also off-job control. It's their phrase. Off-job control means turn people into robots for the rest of their lives. So control them off-job by inducing a philosophy of futility, focusing people on the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and basically get them out of our hair. Let the people who are supposed to run the show do it without any interference from the mass of the population who have no business in the public arena. And from that comes enormous industries, ranging from advertising to universities, all committed to very consciously to the conception that you must control attitudes and opinions because the people are just too dangerous. Actually, they have good constitutional sources for that. The founding of the country was based on the principle, the Madisonian principle, that the people are just too dangerous. Power has to be in the hands of what Madison called the wealth of the nation. People who respect property and its rights and are willing to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. The majority have to be fragmented somehow. But by the 1920s, this became highly self-conscious and major industries, and it's particularly striking that it developed in the more democratic societies. It was later duplicated. They tried to duplicate it in Germany and Bolshevik Russia and South Africa and elsewhere, but it was always quite explicitly on the mostly American model. And why in the democratic societies? Well, there's a good reason for that. If you can control people by force, it's not so important to control what they think and feel. But if you lose the capacity to control people by force, it becomes more necessary to control attitudes and opinions. And it brings us right up to the present. By now it's not so much government agent. It was to some extent, like Reagan had what they called an Office of Public Diplomacy. But by that time, the public was no longer willing to accept state propaganda agencies. So the Reagan Office of Public Diplomacy was declared illegal and had to go in roundabout ways. But instead of this, what took over instead was private tyrannies, basically, corporate systems, which play the role of controlling opinion and attitudes, not taking orders from the government, but closely linked to it, of course. And that's our contemporary system. Extremely self-conscious. I mean, you don't have to speculate much about what they're doing because they're kind enough to tell you, in industry publications and so on. And also in the academic literature. So you go back to, say, the 1930s, perhaps the founder of a good bit of modern political science, liberal, progressive, Wilsonian Harold Lasswell, in 1933 wrote an article called Propaganda. People used the term freely then, before the connotations that came from the Nazis. So it was just openly called propaganda. Now there are various euphemisms. He wrote an article called Propaganda in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences, major publication, in which the message was that we should not, all of these are quotes incidentally, we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. We are. And since people are too stupid and ignorant to understand their best interests for their own benefit, because we're great humanitarians, we must marginalize and control them and the best means is propaganda. There's nothing negative about propaganda. He said it's as neutral as a pump handle. You can use it for good or for evil. And since we're noble, wonderful people, we'll use it for good to ensure that the stupid, ignorant masses remain marginalized and separated from any decision-making capacity. And that's in the hands of us, and we're good by definition, so we'll do the best for everyone. And that includes world government, domestic control, and so on. This is not the right wing that I'm talking about. These are the liberal, progressive intellectuals. And in fact, the Leninist doctrines are approximately the same. There are very close similarities. The Nazis also picked it up. If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler was very impressed with Anglo-American propaganda. He argued, not without reason, that that's what won the First World War, and vowed that next time around the Germans would be ready too, and developed their own propaganda systems modeled on the democracies. The Russians tried it, but it was too crude to be effective. South Africa used it, others, right up to the present. But the real forefront is the United States, because it's the most free and democratic society, and it's just much more important to control attitudes and opinions.
Can you make the leap from propaganda then and its origins to what's going on today with what is called Operation Iraqi Freedom?
Yeah, you can read it in this morning's New York Times. This is... what's today? Saturday?
April 5th.
April 5th. Okay, this morning's New York Times, and the inside, there's an interesting article about Karl Rove, the president's manager, basically. His minder is what they'd call it in Iraq, when it teaches him what to say and do. And it describes what he's doing now, Karl Rove. He's not directly involved in the war planning, but neither is Bush. I mean, this is in the hands of other people. But his goal, he says, is to present the president as a powerful wartime leader aimed at the next presidential election, so that the Republicans can push through their domestic agenda, which is what he concentrates on, which means tax cuts. They say for the economy, but they mean for the rich. Tax cuts for the rich and other programs which he doesn't bother enumerating, but which are designed, if you look at them, to benefit an extremely small sector of the ultra-wealthy and privileged, and will have the effect of harming the mass of the population. But more significant than that, it's not outlined in the article, is to try to destroy the institutional basis for social support systems. So try to eliminate things like schools and Social Security and anything that is based on the conception that people have to have some concern for one another. That's a horrible idea, which has to be driven out of people's minds. The idea that you should have sympathy and solidarity, you should care whether the disabled widow across the town is able to eat, that has to be driven out of people's minds. That's a large part of the domestic agenda, quite apart from just shifting wealth and power even more than it is now towards narrow sectors. And the way to achieve that, since people aren't going to accept it, the way to achieve it, and it's stated explicitly, is to make people afraid. If people are frightened that their security is threatened, they'll gravitate towards the strong leaders. It says they'll trust the Republicans to protect them from enemies, and therefore suppress their own concerns and interests. We'll be able to drive through the domestic agenda, maybe even institutionalize it, so it'll be very hard to reconstruct. And we have to do it by presenting the president as a powerful wartime leader, succeeding in overcoming this awesome foe, which, of course, is chosen because it barely exists and can be crushed in no time.
Iraq.
Iraq. And that's it's laid out pretty explicitly. I mean, not precisely in the words I just used, but the message is very clear.
Well,
so yeah, that's what you do. And it's aimed at the next presidential election. That's a large part of this war.
Clearly, there's a huge gap on the Iraq War between U.S. public opinion and literally the rest of the world. Do you attribute that to propaganda?
There's just no question about it. You can trace it precisely. The campaign about Iraq took off last September. That was... this is so obvious, it's even discussed in mainstream publications, like the chief political analyst for UPI, Martin Seif, has a long article just describing how it was done. It's transparent. In September, which happened to be the opening of the midterm congressional campaign, that's when the drumbeat of wartime propaganda began, and it had a couple of constant themes. One is that Iraq is an imminent threat to the security of the United States. We got to stop them now, or they're going to destroy us tomorrow. The second is that Iraq was behind September 11th. Nobody says it straight out; it's kind of insinuated. They were responsible. The next one is they're planning new such atrocities, and therefore we've got to stop them now, or we're really in danger. Well, take a look at polls. They reflected the propaganda very directly. The propaganda is distributed by the media. They don't make it up; they just distribute it. You attribute it to high government officials or whatever you like. But the campaign was reflected very quickly in the polls. By September, and since then, roughly 60%, oscillating around that, of the population believes that Iraq is a threat to our security. Congress, if you look at the Declaration of October, when they authorized the president to use force, said Iraq is a threat to the security of the United States. By now, about half the population, maybe more by now, believes that Iraq was responsible for September 11th, that Iraqis were on the plains, that they're planning new ones. These attitudes are closely correlated to support for war. And it makes sense. If you believe that Iraq is an imminent threat to our security and was responsible for the September 11th atrocities and is planning new ones, then it makes sense to say, okay, let's go to war to stop them. Now, there is no one else in the world that believes any of this.